Welcome back. We are continuing our one-on-one interviews with the candidates, and our guest right now is the current Attorney General of Guam, Mr. Leevin Camacho. Thanks for joining us, Attorney General. First question, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your work experience.
Yeah, so my dad was in the military, so we moved around quite a bit when I was young, and I moved back home to Guam in 8th grade. I went to FB Leon Guerrero, graduated from JFK, Go Islanders, and after that I went to the University of Washington for my undergraduate degree. Actually came back home and I taught for a year at FB Leon Guerrero. I was a science teacher, and I realized that I wanted to go to law school at that point, so you can't take the LSAT in Guam. You actually have to, so you'd have to fly to Hawaii or somewhere else. So I ended up going back to Seattle, studying for the LSAT, taking it there, and then going to law school in Boston University. I moved back home in 2005. I passed the bar, clerked for 1 year at the Supreme Court here, and I've been in private practice since 2006.
You're completing your first term as Attorney General, and you're running for a re-election. Tell us about your experience as the incumbent AG and why you're seeking a second term.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you don't grow up saying, I want to be the Attorney General. You don't grow up, I was not a very good student in high school. I got by, but I mean, being in public school, college is something I would have been. Neither of my parents had graduated from college when I was a senior in high school. So you're kind of flying blind at that point. You fill out the FAFSA form, take the SATs, and unfortunately, it's not the expectation that you're going to go to college. So I went to college. I did think about being a lawyer. I thought about doing graduate school, potentially becoming a professor, but it was actually teaching in Guam that prompted me to think about law school and just the impact that you can have on many people. Teachers obviously it's amazing. My wife's always like, please don't go back into education, but I love it. Being around kids, I coach soccer, and what is the most that I can do? What's the best way for me to make a positive change? So that was the reason why I went to law school. And I came back home, and as many people do, I had to take loans throughout undergrad. I had over $100,000 in student loans when I graduated from law school. Yeah. So you want to do good things, but you also need to put food on the table. And it was great. I had a great private practice, but it was 2018 that I was volunteering to coach mock trial. And I ran into a group of kids who just reminded me why I set out on this path. And the universe kind of will try to move you back into the course that you were set on. So public service has always been something that I've been interested in, and doing it as the Attorney General is the way that I can make the most positive change for the island.
Yeah. I don't think there's anyone that would disagree that we have a drug problem, and we've had a drug problem, ICE in particular, even since the 1990s. I can recall reporting on that. What have you done, and what will you do in your second term, if you're successful, to address the ICE crisis that we're in the middle of?
Yeah, so my approach would be one of really focusing on aggressively prosecuting the importers of ICE and the dealers of ICE, okay? Because they are the ones who are bringing in hundreds of pounds that have been seized. And I want to recognize the work of our U.S. Postal Service, our postal inspectors, customs, GPD, task force officers. They're doing a great job stopping the drugs. So I think that's where one thing we need to do: interdiction, prosecution, and then for those who are nonviolent offenders, treatment really has to be the way forward. And this goes back to in 2002, 2003, we started these drug court programs, recognizing that just putting someone in jail and hoping that their addiction magically goes away isn't a viable approach. So the way to reduce crime is to invest in treatment programs, whether it's for those who are incarcerated or for other types of treatment programs that are available.
Yeah, it really has to be a comprehensive program. You can't just attack it on one front and leave the others. It has to be all from start to finish, right?
That's right. But I think it's just important when we talk about one of the things that, as a candidate and as voters, you want to make sure that the candidates are going to be truthful. It's very easy to kind of just get into this fear, like, oh my gosh, meth is at an all-time low, right? And not talk about what you're going to do to address it. And there are things that we can do on the enforcement side, prosecution, prevention, but that's going to the world is seeing a decrease in the price of meth. So, just demanding honesty when we talk about the problems that are facing the island, because that's the only way we're going to really address it. But one of the things that we've done, again, kudos to Customs. They're canine officers. So we worked with them earlier this year to help secure 4 additional dogs. And when they were doing their presentations, they were said, like, those 4 dogs have detected 70 pounds of meth, just, dogs. You think, okay, a canine, but how impactful one dog can be on preventing drugs from coming into our island. So you're right, it has to be a holistic approach, preventing the drugs from coming in, identifying and prosecuting drug dealers, drug importers, and then finding for those who are just struggling with addiction, the right programs to help them.
Yeah. In this current term, you actually were involved in getting some new dogs to Guam.
That's
right?
correct. So we partnered with Customs. They said it actually had to deal with flying the dogs here because they can't fly on United. So they had to charter a flight. That was one of the things. So we assisted Customs first time. We partnered with them to bring in 4 additional dogs. They went from, I think, 12. They had 12 dogs. We brought in 4, and they're able to potentially retire some of their older dogs.
Yeah. The perception also is that drugs are at the root of a lot of even the petty crime. And do you see that in the course of your work?
Yeah, I mean, and we keep talking about crime. We mentioned that every forum this comes up. I just want to be clear. We have to be serious. Violent offenders, you're going to go to jail. You're going to be held accountable. Repeat offenders, you need to be held accountable. But it's when we talk about these non-violent offenders, where you have someone has a meth pipe. That is where I really differ from my opponent. Where they're, what Attorney Moreland has said is, put you in jail. That's your treatment. You stay behind bars. And I think that is a failed approach. That's a failed approach from the 90s. The war on drugs didn't work. And treatment programs, which is across the country that we're moving towards, that's where we really need we will make a difference in terms of crime. So the other thing that we've done is the opioid litigation. We've brought in for the first, there are some people like, oh, it's easy, you just roll out of bed and you have $2.5 million in your bank account. And it's not that easy. There's a lot of work that's gone into these cases. We have a great team in our consumer litigation. I mentioned 2.5. That's how much we have today in the bank. We were able to successfully, just this year. Okay, so we have over $12 million that's going to be dedicated to drug treatment and drug prevention programs for not only those who are currently struggling with addiction, but our youth. Because if you can prevent someone who's young from using drugs, that's the best way to prevent potentially even minor crimes as they get older.
Yeah, we've heard indications, and I think it came up during one of the chamber meetings, that fentanyl might be a looming drug for Guam, and that there's already instances where that's come out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we had a meeting earlier this week, and this is, I'm a problem solver. That's the way that and that's the only way you can do this job, because it's easy to dwell on fear and problems and not talk about what you're going to do about it. So we've heard about fentanyl. We've known for quite some time that there's been kind of the opioid problem in Guam is present, but it's not as pronounced as meth. One of the things that we just talked about earlier this week, though, was having the opioid addiction overdose medication available. So right now, Narcan, naloxone, almost every other jurisdiction in the country is available. In Guam, you need a prescription. So at the meeting we had, I believe on Tuesday, we have drafted legislation to start so that our police officers, in case they encounter fentanyl, they have Narcan available to reverse an overdose. We want to have community organizations and their volunteers have access to Narcan, naloxone to help folks. So we're taking concrete steps in anticipation that fentanyl's out there.
Yeah, kind of getting ahead of it before it becomes a real problem like it is in the mainland United States.
That's absolutely right. It's not a front page problem, but it's a problem on the island. Yeah. So we are going to make sure that the $12 million that I mentioned, obviously some of that's going to go towards things like purchasing Narcan for the government of Guam and for community-based organizations.
Yeah. On another topic, we as the media, we get the magistrates' complaints on a daily basis, and you can see anecdotally the rise in domestic violence cases, in particular stalking and that sort of thing. Tell us how pervasive that is in your view as the AG, and what your office can do to address that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, family violence is one of those crimes that is always one of the top misdemeanors charged. It's a very complex issue. So one of the things that we've done, partnerships that we've built. So we work with Guam Police Department, Chief Ignacio and his team, the DART team, the Domestic Assault Response Team, victim advocates reaching out, Vero, and we launched this lethality assessment program earlier this year. And what it is, it's an additional tool that when a police officer responds to a domestic violence call, they have 12 questions, and if they're identified as being high risk, they immediately connect that victim with an advocate to talk to them about emergency planning. Do you need emergency shelter? Is there a place that we can take you? Here's what to do in the event you are able to leave this dangerous situation. So we rolled out a pilot program in the central precinct. We're working with GPD to figure out how we can make this available in other precincts. Scale is the important part. You don't want to launch it and then it fails, right? So we want to make sure the resources are going to be there for both GPD as well as Vero. Other things that we are doing, we can't pass legislation, but we can be in support of it. There were bills earlier this year authored by Senator Torres that dealt with wireless phones. You take for granted your cellular phone.
Sure.
And being able to, if you're in an abusive relationship, take your cell phone and not have it disconnected. There were recently public hearings that we showed up at, and I personally showed up at in support of, for victims of sexual assault could not get a protective order. So Senator Torres and her team had put together legislation that would change that and make these processes available to victims of stalking and victims of sexual assault. So there are all these things that are moving on the policy side where we can't necessarily pass legislation, but we can hope and support it and influence it.
Yeah, that's very interesting because talk a little bit more about how these bills come about and your role, the AG's role in getting the senators to sponsor these bills and working with them to get them, like you say. I mean, you can't pass laws because you're the AG. That's the legislature's job, but you can certainly provide the input. Yeah, if you see there is an issue.
Well, it's one of those things, and I'll be honest. Sometimes the interactions that I have, I'm at the pharmacy and I'm picking up something for my kids. And this is a true story. I was talking to the pharmacist there, and she was the one who brought up naloxone. She said, "Oh, by the way, did you know we had someone come in who their family member is struggling with addiction. They wanted naloxone and Narcan, but we couldn't give it to them. And it would be great to have this available so that we could be behind the counter or just make it more readily available." And then the light bulb goes off, okay, so what can we do? So we can't, being a problem solver, you have to, we need to work on legislation. We don't draft the legislation, but we offer suggestions to these senators because the senators have to do the heavy lifting. They have to get it in the public hearing, get it through committee, get the votes, get it to the governor's desk. But I think the position that we're in to interact with the people who are impacted gives us a different perspective.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we get the magistrate's complaint, and included in those complaints, we can also see the background of the defendant in the case. Mm-hmm. And we do see a lot of, in particular, the domestic violence cases where this particular individual has had, same thing, same instances in previous cases, and they, the judge imposes a temporary restraining order, which they essentially ignore. Talk about that recidivism and the effectiveness of how the court is handling it. And I know I don't want you to be, I know you're in a position where you can't be too critical of the court, but how is it that that's allowed to happen, I guess, is the question.
On our island, sexual assault and domestic violence are such complex issues. And I was just telling a story. You probably covered this last week. There was a sentencing for an individual who had been convicted of sexually molesting and assaulting a young woman. And the victim, her impact statement was written in. We argued for 15 years. The victim's family asked for leniency for the defendant, right? So the dynamic relationship, oftentimes, unfortunately, the defendants in these criminal cases are known to the victim and known to the victim's family. And you're put in a position where you're going to send mom's boyfriend or uncle so-and-so to jail for 15 years. So it's a very tough issue on the island. Family violence is just as complicated. And then we talked about lethality assessment. And part of it is just acknowledging that most people who are in an abusive relationship are not going to leave the first time it happens. They're not going to leave the second time. So our advocates and our first responders need to be there to provide resources for when they are ready to take that step, what's going to happen. So, and I mentioned that you talk about violations of court orders. I mean, you would be surprised how many times there's a stay away and it's the victim saying, come over. It's the victim potentially saying, okay, I forgive you, and they're moving back in. So it just, that relationship is very dynamic. And I went to, I've sat in on some of these trainings, and it's real. Victims are having to choose between being homeless and living with their abuser. And at that point, are you worried about putting food on your table and having a roof over your head? Or are you worried about the fact that this person's on pretrial release? Yeah. So we have the magistrate's complaint. That's surface level, but what we're really dealing with are humans who are in very, very complicated personal relationships.
Absolutely. I appreciate the complexity of it, because at some point, is it emotional damage? Is it the financial considerations?
Financial control.
It's all of that, yeah.
That's correct. So when the pilot program, we actually did 90 days, we assessed it. 70%, we had 40 or so respondents. 70% of them were identified as high risk, which means 70% of them have either been threatened to be killed, have been choked, threatened with a weapon by their perpetrator. And they also were dominating their phones, their social media accounts, and that is what is going on. We were trying to work better on data, because that's the powerful thing about LAP. Now we have a better idea of what's going on in these situations. But the recant rate, or the willingness of a victim to participate in a family violence case, I mean, imagine we go to trial and we're having to impeach the victim, because they're coming to us now saying, I don't want to pursue any charges, it didn't happen, I don't want this person to go to jail.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. So that, again, isn't part of the record, because we're not going to attack a victim, but there's always something happening beneath the surface.
Yeah. I mentioned recidivism earlier, and how about the other incidences like theft and burglary and robbery? Are these guys, just getting out of jail and then going back to doing the same old thing? Because for either for the need for drugs, or for just money to live on.
At robbery and burglary, you should go to jail. You should be held accountable,
Yeah.
and let's be clear about that. Our laws are very clear on that. And drugs are connected to it, which is why, again, the first $230,000 we recovered, half of that went to supporting RSAT, which is the Residential Substance Abuse Treatment Program in DOC. Because you're going to do time, but while you're in there, let's work on the underlying issues, the root causes of why you have committed burglary, you have committed robbery. Because at some point you're going to get out. If you committed burglary, 5 to 10 years in jail. When you get out, what happens to you at that point? So what those programs do, and what we need to do, is support them so that when they get out, as best as we can, avoid them from going back to a life of crime. But absolutely, robbery, burglary, they need to be held accountable.
Yeah, and it's not the Guam Bureau of Prisons, it's the Guam Department of Corrections. And are we lacking in that sort of rehabilitation segment?
It's something where there are always, and that's what we're doing with the opioid use. So the opioid use, we are receiving money from opioid settlements, but it can be used for co-occurring substance abuse disorders. So someone who's struggling for meth, we can also use these funds to assist in those programs. Guam Behavioral, DOC, Lighthouse, TOGI, they're doing a great job, but there's always a need for more resources to assist folks who are struggling with addiction. RSAT program, they always have people waiting to get into those cycles. So if you are in jail for a robbery, burglary, you're going to do time, but again, what are we going to do to make sure you're not going to get released and go back to it?
Yeah. Speaking of the Department of Corrections, it's a fact that there is a disproportionate number of inmates or detainees that are from the freely associated states. What are your thoughts on that issue, and how can that be reversed or
how much time do we have to talk about this?
5 minutes.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. Some of it's lifestyle. I'm not one to kind of play to every minority group who's immigrated to Guam has faced criticism that you're the source of crime,
yeah.
right? I mean, when the Filipinos first came, it was like, oh, you're the reason why we have crime. And FSM communities, unfortunately, now they're feeling that.
And
so,
that was not my implication.
Oh, I know. I'm just, the perception and the way that, unfortunately, members in our community talk about the FSM community, we're talking, you're saying disproportionate, but still a relatively small number compared to the total population of Guam. And one of those things where, we needed to treat them the same way we would treat everybody else. So the other thing that we encounter, and I know I've heard people say, well, I'm going to start deporting, FAS citizens, in particular from one of my opponents who was the AG. And as a voter, again, you have to ask yourself, well, how many people, when you were Attorney General, did you deport as the Attorney? And that's where the honesty in terms of what we can do. We can incarcerate, we can get a jail sentence, but in terms of removing people from Guam, that's a federal function. Yeah.
How about your views on the Chinese from the CNMI that are coming in, backdoor, if you will? It seems to be very organized. They started coming in through Ritidian Point at one time. I think the most recent one, they went all the way around to Pago Bay, which suggests that there is an organized effort to bring them in. the governor has created a task force, which the Attorney General is part of. Can you update us on that and how effective you think the task force has been to this point?
Yeah, so we met very early on when this started happening. Governor brought in local and federal law enforcement entities, and kind of what I was getting at, like immigration into the United States is a federal function, but we weren't going to just sit around and not do anything on the local side. So the task force was created. We recognized there was a statute that had certain requirements. If you are arriving in Guam, you have to have a manifest, you have to ID everyone, you have to provide copies actually of ID of all the passengers, state when you're going to arrive. So we have filed charges, and my understanding is every known boat operator has been arrested and charged in the Superior Court of Guam is reporting to probation. So I would say within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks of standing up the task force, that was the outcome. So it's been very successful. I want to, the customs team, GPD teams have been out there. They've been on boats monitoring. I will say that it did appear organized, but you notice we were having boats coming in regularly, and then it dropped off. And then we had the one in Chalampago last week. But in terms of the frequency, I believe we sent a very strong message that if you're going to transport people to Guam, we're going to find you, we're going to arrest you, and we're going to prosecute you.
Yeah. As you know, criminal prosecution probably gets most of the headlines, the news coverage, but the Attorney General's office is made up of a number of different departments that usually don't get a lot of attention. Talk about your civil side and the other departments within the AG and what you've been able to accomplish in your term.
You mean we do things other than prosecution? No. Yeah, prosecution, public safety is the top priority and will always be the top priority for myself and for the office. But you're right, it does often overshadow. We've had $28 million in child support dispersed to Guam families in the last 3 years. I mean, record numbers of child support arrears have been paid out. One of the things that we talked about were these undistributed funds. We stood up a unit within our child support enforcement division. I think over 400 checks were cut, some of them going back to like early 2000. Okay, people who had waited decades to get paid support that was owed to them. So that was one of the other initiatives. We've also, for the first time in decades, updated our child support software. And we're hoping that once those changes that goes through, it would be nice to be able to check your child support going online and plugging in your case number and a password and being able to see what's going on with child support payments instead of having to come into the office, instead of having to call. Our government won't function if our office isn't functioning. So our solicitor division, which reviews contracts, hundreds of contracts every year, our civil litigation division, which represents the government defending as well as prosecuting cases. One of the things that we've done, it's so far ago, right, long ago, but do you recall when these pay adjustments were done in executive session? We took action, those were repaid, and then we found out about other cases. We sued, we filed a lawsuit to undo those things, and we got payment. That settlement was used to pay off utility bills for those who were completing drug treatment programs, because we heard about cases where you have a $200 outstanding power bill and you can't get into assisted living, or assisted housing. So just imagine, like, okay, I can clear a bed for someone to get treatment, but they have a $200 outstanding power bill. So that's what that settlement is going to be used for. Our consumer protection division, we've talked about the millions in historic settlements that we've recovered. Environmental, we have a 9-0, we have a unanimous win at ORDOT. We are continuing to push for justice and to hold the Navy accountable there. We've defended NEPA. We have the Sasad's case, the Marble Cave case. First time we've ever filed any kind of action like that, ever, as an office. Historic recovery, and it's, every month it's historic, and it ends up dwarfing, like, oh, 500,000 doesn't sound like a lot when we're talking 12 million, but that's $500,000 that's going to go towards erosion control programs through the University of Guam, cultural preservation programs with the Guam Preservation Trust. So all of the recoveries that we're having, it's going to impact the island in a positive way.
All this diverse work that your office is doing, talk about your staffing.
Okay.
Is there a need for more?
We need more prosecutors. Yes, absolutely. We have 13 full-time attorneys right now within prosecution. We need more. The concrete steps we've taken, we've asked the court to, right now it's a 5-year temporary admission. We've asked for 3 more years. The first time that's been considered since I've been an attorney in 2005. We also, this last term, were able to get a differential pay for prosecutors. So we are now paying our prosecutors effective 10/1 in line with what a prosecutor in a small city would be making stateside. So those are 2 concrete things. We are also advertising online, over 80 schools nationally. So we are doing what we can. But overall, we have 53 attorneys in the office right now. We are the largest law firm on the island. When I started, we had 54. Today, we have 53. So it's not like there's a huge, we need more prosecutors, but every division in our office, except for prosecution, is functioning and working for the people.
All right, Attorney General, we've got about a minute left. I ask you to look into camera 3 and tell the people who go on why they should vote for you.
Yeah, you know, at the end of the day, it comes down to what type of candidate do you want to represent you? Someone who's going to fight for you, who's going to be honest, who's going to tell the truth, and really cares deeply about their home. I'm not here to offer you fear. What I'm here to offer you is the vision that I have is of an office that will work for the people so that we have safe communities, a clean environment, and a government that functions. So I'm Leevin Camacho, and I'm number 2 on the nonpartisan Attorney General ballot.
All right, Attorney General Leevin Camacho, candidate once again for Attorney General. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more right after this.